Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third edition of Systemic Justice's Reframing Climate Justice Speaker Series. My name is Sámi Blassingame, and I'm very happy to be here and to be in conversation with two lovely people and activists today. The first that I'll introduce is Rukiatu. Rukiatu is a co-organizer of the Collective Against Environmental Racism in Copenhagen, Denmark. This is a collective of non-binary people of color and women of color working at the intersection of environmentalism, anti-racism, and climate justice, amplifying the voices of those most affected by environmental racism globally. With a MSc in political science, Rukiatu is committed to uncovering structural disparities in racism within the climate governance agenda of green transition. She aims to challenge contemporary sustainability practices, emphasizing the urgent need to expose and confront the unequal and often devastating impacts of the climate crisis, particularly on marginalized communities. Welcome, Rukiatu. How are you? How are you coming into this space today?
I'm coming in super excited to have this conversation. A little bit overwhelmed, but I'm excited just to be here and be in conversation with you both.
Yeah, nice to have you, Rukiatu. And along with Rukiatu, we have Niila. Niila is a member of the Youth Council of the Finnish Sámi Parliament as a board member of the Finnish Sámi Youth, and is well aware of many current issues, especially those related to spatial justice. Niila has been active in the discussion about climate change and nature loss, but reminds us that the green transition cannot happen at the expense of Indigenous peoples by violating human rights. Niila, welcome. How are you? How are you coming to this?
I'm great. A little nervous, but excited.
No need to be. We are just in conversation with ourselves. This whole series is about us as organizers and activists around Europe, sharing our thoughts and our work, and ideally building together a sort of collective consensus of some sort on what we're looking at, what we're thinking about, and what we need to be doing as a general, very, very broad understanding of BIPOC climate organizers, right? So we'll get into more of that as well. I just want to check out the tech a little bit, because I can't see how I can write to all of the attendees. So in case you are watching and you'd like to share something in chat and you can't, you can pose it as a question in the Q&A maybe as well. And we'll see it there, in case that technical thing is not working. Okay, perfect. So yeah, as I was saying, this series is all about us talking and hearing from many people that are active in what we would call a BIPOC climate justice movement across Europe. And it's the third in the series, third of 6. So if you're joining us just now, I encourage you to go back and also check out part 1 and part 2 when you get a chance. Those are on the Systemic Justice website. Episode 1, we defined that climate justice is a process of upending the various systems of extraction and oppression which have caused the climate crisis in the first place. And in episode 2, we reflected on how this racial, capitalist, colonialist mindset gets perpetuated today. And we called attention to the many aspects of dominant society that we must continue to unlearn and reimagine in our fight for climate justice. So today I'm very excited to explore the concept of spatial justice as it relates to some of these things that we've been talking about, and to hear from both of you some specific examples of how this has shown up and how it is showing up currently in the communities you're part of. So I guess the first question is really how you understand this concept. What is spatial justice to you both? And what does it mean to you and to your communities, maybe? What are you thinking about when you think of this term? Whoever would like to start, you're welcome.
Niila, do you want to go or?
Start.
Okay. Well, I think spatial justice to us, to me, in the collective, I think a lot of the time we talk about a more sort of reflective and inclusive idea about how we all can be and exist in peace in a way. Because I think oftentimes in the Danish society, there's this idea about what's it called? Fairness and equity, or like at least equality to some extent. So spatial justice for me and looks like a more sort of reflective approach to sort of address systemic inequalities and basically promoting inclusion and sort of an awareness that empowers the residents and the people who are in the spaces that we're talking about. So the services and the area is in service to those people. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Niila, how about you?
Yeah, for me, spatial justice goes more to like justice to land and like colonial history as being part of indigenous people, in specific Sámi people. And I don't know how many know about Sámi people, but Sámi people are indigenous peoples from the northern parts of Sweden, Norway, and Finland, and also some parts of northern Russia. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's
about
good.
it.
I think let's start with kind of situating us. Like, what more? I'm sure people, I hope people have heard of the Sámi people, but is there more that you'd like to say about who your communities are and what that looks like in Finland, particular, maybe because that's where you are based, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to start with.
That's okay. I think that it would be good to kind of give a little bit more of where, a little bit more of a visualization of where you both are coming from. I read your bios, right? But you only get a little bit from this, right? So on a day-to-day maybe, or like, yeah, like what is it in Denmark and in Finland? If, you know, I usually am based in Germany, and so I know this German context of organizing there, but maybe you'd like to say a little bit more about organizing in your parts of Europe.
Sure. We are a blend of different people in the collective. I personally have roots in both West and East Africa, and we are like both people from indigenous people from Brazil, people from South Africa, Liberia in West Africa, Kenya. We're like a broad mixture of different people. So I think also with that kind of different blend of people, we're also very aware of, in Somalia for that matter, also like aware of different struggles. Like we have a member who comes from Somalia who also, you know, brings in reflections about neocolonialism happening in the Ogaden region, which is also a conversation that we don't really sort of have reflections about generally in the environmental sort of movement here in Denmark, and how sort of the perpetuation of neocolonialism and green colonialism on the continent by states that we not typically associate with perpetuating colonialism. So with the whole mixture of different kind of people, I think we bring in so many different perspectives. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, compared to that, I have a little one-sided opinions. But yeah, I'm a like active in like all sorts of like indigenous and like Sámi rights, and discussions and politics and everything. My brain isn't working yet.
No worries. I'm thinking about how I'm thinking about the different groups of us that are organizing in this collective, like broad movement, if we want to call it that, right? And thinking about how like my experience is similar to Rukia's in that I am a migrant to Germany, right? So and most of my organizing is with other migrants that have found themselves in Germany. And so there's groups like that, and bringing all of our perspectives together is an interesting experience. And then there's groups like the Sámi community or the community that you organize with, Niila, that are maybe have similar perspectives because you're coming from a similar experience in that way. But I'm just thinking about all the differences of those groups and what that means to organize together and think together and work towards something in a similar vein. And that brings me back to what spatial justice is, right? Like the typical definition of it is that spatial justice links social justice to space. And it's typically thought of in an urban context, analyzing like the impacts of certain planning decisions on how people are able to live in the services and resources that they have access to, often in urban spaces, sometimes more regionally. But I think in our previous conversations, it was also interesting to think of spatial justice in a more broad sense, right? Of like in regard to the atmospheres that we inhabit and we make together, and the ways in which we relate to one another in physical spaces. So beyond just like the planning and like technicalness of this, like what is spatial justice in how it allows us, as Rukia said, to just be? What do we need for that? What does that require? Yeah, and I think that's interesting to try to expand it that way. And I know some, in doing some research, people are expanding that term to use it in different ways. And I think it's important to do that. I don't know if you have an immediate reaction to that, but
what I'm thinking especially is that we are very sort of aware that, we all have busy lives and like, running from here to there, just, moving. So when we come together in the collective, we're very, always like, okay, how are you feeling? And very sort of aware of the different sort of contexts that people are coming from, and like seek to have this kind of a care mentality as a means of also resisting the busyness that can be with the work that we're just with life in general, but also the kind of work that we're dealing with, because there's also a lot of emotional labor that goes into the stuff that we're talking about. So we're very adamant about having this what's the word in Danish? We call it like this softness, at least to each other. Yeah, checking in and taking breaks, and just softness, I guess, is the word I want to say. Yeah,
it's a very important thing, especially in movements for climate justice, where sometimes it's extremely it feels very urgent and we need to just do things, but to remind ourselves that to do it the best way is also to take our time.
right.
As Bayu always says, no, it's slow. The climate crisis is urgent. Let's go slow. Yeah. Some Pia in the chat is saying it's hard to do when activism can often feel like it's only legit if it's direct action. Yeah, but what are other forms of activism that we're thinking of, right?
I think we want to we don't get to do that as often as we would like to, but we want to get together more often and also focus on doing our own stuff, because a lot of the time we get contacted by people who want to collaborate or sort of have our inputs and like engage with us, but it almost becomes no, it's the right word. Extractive in a way where there's like this like labeling, oh, you work with Collective Against Environmental Racism, so now there's like a go and on the project that you're working with. So like also we have many conversations about like focusing on also doing stuff for ourselves and by ourselves. Because otherwise you get burned, really lost in the process.
Yeah. I can resonate with that, definitely.
Yeah.
You too, Niila?
Yeah. Thinking about like our Sámi youth communities, it's like everyone has their own life, like outside of the communities. But like maybe one of the most important things about our communities is like to bring the people together and get a place where people can share their experiences and that kind of stuff.
Is that what most of the kind of work or organizing looks like for you, is creating these spaces where you can come together and discuss and share? And
yeah, like our organization, it's like a youth organization, and our like goal is to bring people together and like host events and that sort of stuff. But at the same time, we have needed to take part in like political stuff and activism and that kind of stuff. So it's like a little bit of both.
Yeah, making time for both is important. I asked that because part of spatial justice, and we'll move into this, that I've understood is, especially as it relates to climate justice, is procedural justice, what they call it. And I understand that as like the processes we enable in order to achieve justice. And when I think about planning and how we decide on how to build a city or build a space, or how we decide how to use our land resources, that requires space and time to hear from one another and, you know, debate, form some sort of consensus. And if that's not happening, justice is likely not able to be reached in that. You know, and sometimes I think a lot of the times we are so clear on like doing something together, we forget to just create the spaces to know each other and hear each other and be a little bit. And so in my trying to expand my understanding of spatial justice and broaden that definition in my mind, I think of that as an important element of it. Yeah, I see Miriam's question in the chat about some forms of spatial injustice that you're resisting on one hand, and your visions of spatial justice that you aspire to collectively on the other. And I want to sit with that question for a little bit, and I think we'll come back to it. But I'm curious. I think I'd like to go into this, like refer to the title of this webinar, this redlining to greenlining thing, and talk a little bit about what that is in a European context. So this term, I'm not sure how many people know this term, redlining, or if they've heard it before. So, and it's a very US term. I know it as a US term, and it's a discriminatory practice with where like financial services and other kind of social services are barred, are redlined, or like taken away. The access to these things are kind of taken away significantly for racialized and other ethnic communities. And like I said, it's most prominent in the United States. It's kind of a process of like politically designating certain areas, and then certain services go to those areas or not. And so I'm curious, in both of your experiences, how do you see that has shown up in a European context? What does that look like here in Europe? If you have any examples you'd like to share.
Yeah. I think in the Danish context specifically, we don't really talk about, like, use at least the sort of category of redlining. But we have many practices that very much resembles that. And I think what we in the collective have been working a lot with in support of so many other groups here in Denmark, especially Modstand, which is working against what is called the ghetto law, or like it's a package of different laws that basically seeks to rid out what is deemed parallel societies, or like black holes on the Danish map. It seemed as a way of sort of bettering society, or upscaling particular areas that have been deemed ghettos and like socially sort of challenged. But the practice and the what's included in this law very much resembles what I at least know from the US context to be redlining, because, you know, there's this idea of like over policing, what's it called, removing, or like right now there's going on 3,745 buildings that are going to be sort of demolished because of the ethnicity of the people who are living there, right? So there's this idea that people are not integrating or engaging with the larger Danish societies, so therefore these houses have to be broken down as a means of forcing these people to integrate or engage more with the larger Danish society. So we have a whole lot of measures within this policy or within this law that basically forces people to have their kids in daycare for like 25 hours or 25 to 30 hours a day, or like double penalty zones if you live in this area, or just, you know, crazy measures that you wouldn't think of a society that brands itself as a socially sort of, you know, aware and like, you know, has this very equity or equality sort of branding to the public. And I'm laughing, not really because I think it's funny, but because I think just the way that Denmark sort of positioned itself is really contradictory to how it's treating its minority citizen and how it categorizes these people. So very much so the redlining example, it's to be seen with the ghetto law, at least here in Denmark.
Yeah, wow. I didn't understand that it had all these declarations of like daycare and like I thought it was just about like the demolition of these houses. So that's, I don't know how many people are hearing this for the first time. So I just want to make sure it's clear that this is a group of laws that's really addressing certain communities in the country and essentially forcing them to assimilate in a certain way. Am I understanding that correctly?
Right. So these areas are basically targeted because they're deemed black holes, and there's this idea that, you know, they call people non-Western women who stay at home or take care of the kids. You know, in a wide context, when you do that, it's not socially sort of looked down upon. But here, if you come from this particular area, you're forced to put your kids into daycare for, I think, 25 to 30 hours a week. Or if you come from this area and you do certain crimes, you're punished more extensively than you otherwise would be punished if you live in another area. Or just, you know, there are just some measures where it seems as if it's very much specifically targeting, because one of the markers for becoming, or like for the demolition of these housing, is the ethnicity marker. If there's a certain level of or a certain percentage of immigrant living in this area, then it's sort of categorized as a ghetto, where if all of the same social challenges are present in a white area, but it's mostly white people, that area is not categorized as a ghetto. Excuse me. So right now we have about 11,000 plus people who have already been, forcibly removed from their houses, and these blocks that are being demolished are either being resold or changed to youth apartments, or like elderly apartment, or they are demolished and sold to private companies that then rebuild. And that's where the climate aspect especially comes in, where we talk a lot about where they're demolished, and then they're resold to private companies that then build houses out of worse materials and double the pricing for it. So
wow. And these people who are being asked to leave these spaces, the idea is that they will be rehoused with Danish society, typical Danish society. Is that the idea?
Well, their idea is that they're offered, they're not like the government are not obliged to rehouse them, but they're provided offers that can be, let's say, if they live in Valkeapää, which is an area that's it's called Fyn. Like if they're living there and they are provided with rehousing, what's it called? Opportunities, it's not like a necessity for it to be in that same area that their house is being demolished. Some of them can be provided housing in like very far away, or like that costs like double the price. And if they don't take that offer, that's basically boo-hoo, because they've already been offered something, right?
Wow,
So
that sounds so familiar.
Right?
Okay, thank you for sharing this. Scarily like the UK, it says. Yeah, and it's really a solid example of this redlining to greenlining, right? Because the mainstream thing is that this is good, this is positive, we're doing a good thing for society. But when you really look underneath it, it's a whole nother form of discrimination and direction and like top-down defining of who people are and what they should be doing. And I think, Niila, you also shared that that's a very similar experience as well.
Yeah. I don't have like similar experiences like in lately, but in like, if you think about history of the Sámi people, like there are similar ways of doing stuff. Like I think until like the 1960s or 1970s, there was like boarding schools that they would Finnish people would take Sámi children and force them to speak Finnish instead of their mother tongue, and
away from their families, right? So
yeah.
And that was that enshrined in law? Was that like,
I don't know about the law aspects of that, but it was like forcibly took the children out of their families and like forbid everything basically that they know. Because it was like the Finnish people were trying to make Sámi look bad and trying to change the Sámi to be more like Finnish people.
And last time you shared that, like you say historically, but I'm not sure how long ago this was happening, but last time you shared that like only in the 1960s that they were still doing eugenics on Sámi people.
Yeah.
The
first part of the 20th century, they were still doing that. And it's like scary to think that it's a part of Finnish history that it's like in such a big denial, and like no one in Finland, like Finnish people, don't like know about it. And if they like hear about it, they're like, no, that's not true. That cannot be true. And for Samis, it's been like traumatizing, and it's like until this day, there is like so much generational trauma caused by everything.
I can imagine. Yeah. Because it's still not something it's like you're still fighting for certain rights and your ability to find yourselves. Am I correct?
Yeah. In Finland, there is the Sámi Parliament Act that's now been in the works for the renewal has been in the works for 12 years, I think, and during 4 different parliaments, some like 7 different prime ministers, and basically the main idea of the renewal of the law is to make it so that the Sámi have the right to decide about their own stuff. Because right now, the Finnish government has the last word on everything that the Sámi parliament decides. And
which is wild, right? Like if you have your own parliament, you're able to make decisions, but at the end of the day, the Finnish government can just say whatever they want.
Yeah.
So what is the point of a parliament then? Like how are they justifying that?
And the Sámi parliament doesn't even have like any like crucial power to use. They don't have the rights to any land or that kind of stuff. It's just more like cultural and educational stuff that. And big problem with the current law is that there's a loophole for some Finnish people to get into the Sámi parliament. Some people have like dug through like some old files and stuff from like the 1600s, 1700s, and found something that they're like, oh, this is like connected to the Sámi people, and then they have tried to get into the Sámi parliament, which the Sámi parliament have rejected, and then people have complained to the Finnish court, and the Finnish court has ruled that they are allowed in the Sámi parliament. I guess the approval of the Sámi.
Wow. So that's a big fight right now, is basically defining yourselves, being able to define your needs, and for that to be recognized by the Finnish state.
Yeah, but on top of that there is also like racism and all of the land rights to land discussions and stuff.
Yeah. Jess in the chat has said how scary it is to think that history becomes sort of normalized with these practices.
There was just a presidential like debate before the election, and one of the candidates like stated Finland doesn't have any colonial history.
Wow.
And we raised a little storm from it, but.
And I assume nobody corrected. Nobody.
Yeah, nobody. And there was like 8 people in the discussion.
Wow. Other politicians who had the opportunity to correct or.
Yeah. One of them commented on that later, but not at the moment.
Not in the moment. Yeah. Interesting. So I'm thinking, because like in thinking about spatial justice and preparation for this talk, I still had Ruth Wilson Gilmore in my mind about how she talks about racial capitalism and how in Europe, or in many parts of the world, but she was speaking particularly about how in Europe, people were segregated as a means to fuel capitalism, and capitalism requires inequality and racism, and shines that that's how she defines racial capitalism in some ways. And I was thinking about that in the concept of spatial justice, because it's almost like our dominant societies have really taught us and created a way for so many people to be like, if I don't see it, it's not happening, you know, like, which is where the ability to segregate and then to do things like this kind of flourishes, I would say. And we see it on a local level with the examples you're sharing, of course, well, kind of, which is why I'm bringing this up, because in this example, the Sámi people are still very much being pushed aside and not recognized. And in this Danish example, I'm kind of hearing it as like, we no longer want you to be pushed, or like in certain societies, we want it to be integrated. And so people do see it, but then they do it in this very top-down colonial way where that's still not just. And so it's just an interesting thing. Like, there's never a one way to look at anything, right? You have to sit with the nuances of everything.
It's this idea that, you know, assimilation, or like this idea that there's that by doing this, that you force people to become more Danish, whatever that means. But also the bar keeps changing or moving, or like this Danishness keeps changing, right? So even though like there is this idea, like here specifically in the Danish context, like they're addressing it or not pushing people to the side, but they're still like, oh, okay, you can meet this goalpost of Danishness by integrating and by becoming more and more. But then when people reach to an extent that goalpost, and it's moved. So in a way, it's almost seems as if it's unreachable. So they're not sort of pushing it to the side, but they're still deeming some people disposable in that process of sort of attending to racial capitalism.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so we see it in these examples, we see it locally, and some of the other examples that I was thinking of were like migrant housing centers or lagers in Germany, and how like they're so at the peripheries of society, and there's so much laws around how people are able to move. And the whole idea of spatial justice ultimately is about who has the right to a place, who has the right to the city, who has the right to this region. And on a global scale, we can also connect this to like who has the right to Fortress Europe, and who has the right to move around it, who has the right to be in it and seek the benefits of the extraction that has built the wealth and prosperity of this part of the world. And so I think that's important to think about in this conversation, and obviously, and when we're talking about climate justice. So I just want to make sure you think about that, because this sort of concept of like, if I don't see it, it's not happening, is so interesting, because like we're also in the media age, and right now we're seeing multiple, but particularly one genocide unfolding constantly on our cell phones. And so there is no more, you cannot see it. We actually do know all these things are happening, and still we are having a hard time reaching some folks. And it's pretty hard to see, I will say.
I think now it's more so not that we cannot see it, because like you're saying, it's very much there, but we are acknowledging, or like we're coming to the point where some zones or some areas or some people, some bodies are just deemed what's the word? We can sacrifice them as sacrificial sort of zones or people.
Yeah, sacrifice them.
Yeah, for the sake of the greater good, whoever that is. So I think we're not so much, oh, we can't see it, or it doesn't exist. It's very much I think in the Danish society, there's very much sort of an acknowledgement that people, that these things are happening, because I think a couple of years ago, when you were just talking about migrant as centers, we have it here in Denmark as well, and there was at some point a migrant center placed on an island called Lolland, which is a very minor island, but people didn't want them there. They knew they were there, but they lobbied, they demonstrated, they very much were adamant about not having these people in their spaces. So they acknowledge that they're there, but they don't want them in their spaces, right? And they deem these people like that we can sacrifice them, and like we don't, like we wanted to the I don't know, like we wanted like the sacrifice zones somewhere else than at least in our spaces where we know that they're there. Yeah,
That's what a wild thing to wrap our heads around. Yeah. So I'm thinking about this. Yeah, I'm trying to think about this in like a European level, but also I can't help but think of it globally, as I said. But ultimately, like when we are talking about spatial justice in relation to climate justice, I've heard some people link this to like the just transition sort of narrative of, like I said before, this procedural justice of who's involved, what are the processes we allow in order for justice to be achieved in whatever sort of shifts we're making in society. And there's many examples of communities being pushed aside and not recognized in these processes. There was a big report just, I think, in 2021 of like Roma communities in Eastern Europe and the environmental racism they face. And I think if we give more attention to researching and documenting these things, there will be much more examples, because still I feel like in our communities we have a lot of US focused examples of environmental racism, but we really need to bring it to what's happening around here as well. So I look forward to much more of that. And I know, for example, like Niila, you've shared many examples of fights that your communities are in, but the most popularized ones that I feel like we hear of are like wind farms and things that are being proposed on Indigenous lands, and then fought. And that's a real important example of just transition and who gets to decide and how we collectively decide our land resources and things like that. I don't know if you want to say a bit about these more popularized examples as well.
Yeah. Yeah, the biggest climate justice case maybe right now in Sámi is the Fosen case, where there's a Norwegian state-owned energy company who has built, I think it's like 177 windmills. So it's the biggest windmill park in Norway. They have built that to the traditional indigenous land that the Sámi people have lived for hundreds of or not thousands years, and they have destroyed the reindeer grazing areas, and so the local municipality went to court against the Norwegian government, and they won. And it's now been 870 days since the municipality won the court case. And since then, the 170 something windmills have been on the indigenous land against the Norwegian law, ruled by the Norwegian government.
So it was a superficial procedural justice of winning a court case and then nothing actually happening
Yeah.
about this.
Yeah, and we have protested like many times. Last September, there was a week-long protests in Oslo against the wind farm, but it doesn't get us anywhere because the government doesn't want to do anything about it.
It's really nice.
What was that, Rukiatu?
No, I'm just saying that's really messed up. Like how can you have sorry, how can you have like a state built on laws, but like you have a verdict and something, and then you're going to get, wow, interesting.
Yeah, so the Norwegian government is like breaking its own laws.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
if you like think about like climate justice, or as we spoke earlier, that we cannot maybe talk about justice or more like fairness. And like thinking about like the indigenous communities and what they have contributed towards climate change, and that they are not the reason for the climate change, but they are the ones who need to pay the most for it. And that's where the climate justice comes in.
And when we spoke before, you mentioned how like you have a problem with this term justice, but I don't remember what exactly. Do you want to share a bit about like your thoughts around justice? Like, was it this about like how it's not reached? I don't know. Do you remember when we talked about this?
I don't remember.
Okay,
I think that was
was it
So
you? Was it you? So one of you mentioned something about like
Yeah.
criticizing this term for some reason. I thought it was really
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
No, I think we were speaking specifically about what justice means, because what I said in the beginning, that a lot of the time when you talk with, environmental organizations and like Danish, at least, ideas about just transition and like climate governance, like there's this idea that, profit and like what is achievable, what is technically sort of necessary, doesn't always include justice. And I think in the Danish context, at least, it's easier to talk about fairness, because justice almost becomes too radical for people to sort of deal with, because there's not this understanding that we are at least contributing to something that's unequal, in regards to, let's say, Niila's point about acknowledging colonialism and acknowledging our engagement in necessary in evils, or at least some things that are happening like globally. So without that recognition, I don't even think that we can talk about I think it's easier at least to come to this conversation of when it's just fairness, because justice becomes too radical for many to sort of address.
Yeah. I'd love to get into like how we are shifting our organizing in order to deal with that on a real level, but I think that's not a conversation for Zoom and not a conversation for recorded Zoom. So maybe another time. I'd like to pick up Tasia's, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, but your comment in the chat, or your question about whether, if I'm understanding correctly, you're asking whether marginalized communities like racialized immigrant communities are most affected by the climate crisis, like in terms of events like floods, for example, and what governments in the European Union are doing about it. I don't know if either of you want to answer that or shed any little lights about it.
Sorry, can you?
The question is basically like, I'm understanding it as like, is it true? Do marginalized communities, are they most affected by the climate crisis, like floods in Europe? Are they who are most affected? And what are governments or European Union doing about this environmental injustice? I think I feel like I will just say the first part. Yes, of course they are, because of course they are, because if while we are all going to be affected by climate crisis, everyone, no matter what, because of the social structures that we have allowed to be perpetuated for so long, there are certain communities that will feel it more strongly. They'll be more affected by it, and they'll be less able to adapt to it because of the inequalities that are already present in our societies. And so I think that's it. I guess the second part of that question, if either of you have anything you want to say for that, what are European unions and governments doing about it? You know, we have the Green New
Deal. Really have expertise for that.
Yeah, no problem. We have like the European Green New Deal, but there's lots of justice aspects involved in that, like who gets to decide that as well. We get back to who is involved in these conversations, who decides what aspects of the Green New Deal are implemented and how.
Yeah, and I think just last year, coming off of COP28, there was like this idea or conversation about, adaptation and like funding and like giving money back to the global South. But in Denmark, a lot of that money was going to be taken from what's it called? Foreign aid. So where's the justice in that, right? It's money that we're already supposed to be giving to countries, because I think that, this and that's the, I don't know how to say that, but that's the thing that I really have and feel really strongly about when it comes to the Danish state, or like at least European states, where like there's this conversation about, oh, we're already doing it, or we're already a part of this just transition, or like contributing, but like there's always a backdoor, like something where when you read like in the small text, then something else is happening.
Yeah, that's such an important distinction to make, and an understanding to have, that like, okay, that sounds good, but when you really look at things, what's actually happening? And there's so much of that work that we need to be doing in all of our areas. And so thank you for sharing that little information. I'd like to go back to Miriam's comment and my kind of closing question as we reach the end of our webinar together. You've shared a lot about the injustices, spatially and otherwise, that you are fighting alongside the communities you're part of. But would you like to share a bit about your visions for spatial and climate justice? What does that look like for you moving forward? You personally, but also collectively, if you are able to frame that as well. Yeah. Whomever would like to go first.
Niila, do you want to go?
I think I need to think a bit.
Okay.
Well,
yeah, we can think about it.
I think
I think in Finland, like one of the biggest problems about like spatial justice and the Sámi people is the lack of knowledge and how like people aren't taught anything about the Sámi people, and which comes in the end that people don't know anything about us, and people don't know what to do, and
So a vision of kind of spatial and climate justice for you is first and foremost like an understanding.
Understanding and like acknowledging.
And I would say not just by the countries that have colonized the Sámi people, but by all of us across Europe, as like a real understanding of Sámis in being part of the BIPOC climate justice movement, and what does that look like to support that cause in everything we do?
Like thinking about global scale and people not knowing about like Sámi people, I find it like understandable, because we're like in the end a small minority. But when the thing is that Finnish people don't know like any basic facts. And for me, I have lived in Helsinki for all of my life, so out of the traditional land. Of course, visiting there a lot, but still, like there is like conversations with like new people and telling that I'm Sámi, or it's coming to discussion at some level, and then there's always the same questions that like, oh, like, are you so you come from the north, and how many reindeer do you have, and that kind of stuff, which is like, it shows that the people really don't know anything.
Yeah, they know the stereotypical understanding.
Yeah.
Which you shared with us also, that the Finnish government, or like the colonizers, continuously come up with new frames and new stereotypes to other you in many places, which is
like I feel like the basic stereotype of a Sámi is a dirty, old, alcoholic man.
Wow. I've only met really incredible young activists. So I guess we all just need to meet more Sámi people, because then that stereotype would change, hopefully. Rukiatu, how about you? What's your sort of vision for how we move forward in terms of spatial justice, spatial and climate justice?
I think that for me and collectively, we always, and I always talk about asking questions, or at least, having this very intersectional approach and asking questions about who's present and what value is being created. Because in that process of particularly addressing climate organizations or climate movements, or like, organizing groups who don't have like a justice aspect, or like, a reflective aspect of how to be more inclusive, when they ask the question of who is there and what value is being provided, then I think there is at least a reflexivity and an awareness about who they are and who they're excluding in that process. And I think the exclusion part is really important, because then you get to be reflective about who then do you need to reach out to, then do you need to sort of engage with to be able to have at least a more inclusive climate movement, and think more inclusively about spatial justice and climate justice. So my vision would be that we all think about who's present and what value is being created. And in that way, we all become a little bit more equitable, at least closer to a more just movement. Because if I don't ask who's not next to me, or I don't ask who isn't, or who is, or reflective about who is, then I'm not taking stock of what I'm doing and what I'm creating.
Yeah. It's just constantly bringing us back to that, this push for a green future has externalities, and how are we have to constantly hold our politicians, the leaders, the entrepreneurs accountable towards the fact that your green solutions are not as straightforward and clear as you think they are. There's other ways of life that are extremely valuable, and other ways that we could build our societies that give us all a little bit more spaciousness and room to breathe and be. And that's often what you find, at least what I've found, that BIPOC, as broad as that term is, communities are often talking about. about like just being and being spacious in our ability to live decent lives. And that looks so different in all these different places, but a general thing that kind of binds us is that understanding that other ways of life are fully possible, and we've just been limited in our ability to think about that and implement it.
Yeah, and we really, really have to do away with this idea that some areas and some people and bodies are sacrificed. That's the word I can't say.
Sacrifice.
Can be sacrificed at least, because with that mentality, I don't think there's any kind of justice coming to us anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us on our third episode. Any last words from you? Any last things? All right. It was a pleasure.
I feel
Yeah.
like if I start to talk about something, it will take a half an hour more.
Well, the conversation can continue going. And for those that are watching, like, reach out to these folks, reach out to us, continue these conversations. Like, they shouldn't just be this hour-long thing. These are meant to just inspire a bit of thought and thinking, but we all need to be in communication with each other on a continuous basis. So I encourage those who have found this recording or who joined us today to continue these conversations in your own spaces and reach out to these incredible activists and community organizers and others in this series and continue it. There are multiple gatherings being planned this year for us to be together and to see each other. So like, reach out, let's do this. Thank you, Pia, for sharing the links where you can sign up to watch or see the last episodes. Make sure you follow Systemic Justice on Instagram or on their website, get their newsletter so that you can follow the next episodes. Thank you so much, Niila, Rukia, and everyone who's joined. Have a beautiful rest of your day. Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.